It would be wildly presumptuous of me to come on here and say the critics are lying to you and they just pretended to like this show when really it's no good. So I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to think it really loudly. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is MickeyJo and I am obsessed with all things theatre, which is why I am as sad to be making this video as you may be to watch it. I am a professional theatre critic based here in the UK, and I recently went to New York to see a bunch of Broadway and off-Broadway shows, largely because before I even booked my flights, I booked tickets to go and see this. Here We Are, which was premiering at the Shed off-Broadway in New York. This is the last ever musical that will feature a new score by the Pulitzer and Tony Award-winning musical theatre composer Stephen Sondheim. The composer behind such works as Sweeney Todd, Company, Follies, Into the Woods, Merrily We Roll Along, A Little Night Music, and more, as well as the lyricist behind West Side Story and Gypsy. In my lifetime, I'd been lucky enough to see the European premiere of a Sondheim musical. I saw Roadshow when it was performed at the Menier Chocolate Factory, but I had never seen a world premiere, and I knew that I would never get the chance again, because unfortunately Stephen Sondheim passed away a few years ago, making Here We Are incredibly special. And there's been a lot of chatter and a lot of talk about the extent to which this was finished and whether or not this was really a full show. There were a lot of rumours about whether or not this would eventually come to the stage, but here we are and here it is. So needless to say, bought myself some tickets, hopped on a plane, went over to New York, saw a bunch of shows, including this one, where it should be said my favourite show was the current revival of Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along. That is extraordinary. It's another of his brilliant works, finally exposed for the genius that it really is in a production that actually works for it. Unfortunately, if that was the best thing I saw in New York, this was maybe one of the worst, if not the worst. But this video is also not necessarily a review. I say that because when I got in touch with the press team, they didn't have much by way of ticket allocation, which is understandable. Everyone is going to want to go and review the last ever Sondheim musical. This is obviously going to be very popular among critics, so I didn't begrudge that. But I also learned that the performance I ended up going to was, I believe, prior to the show being frozen for official press performances. So technically what I attended was a preview. A late preview, but a preview nonetheless, which precludes me from really being able to review. I did buy my ticket, so ultimately I can do whatever I want, but there is also a code of conduct that suggests that that is not something that should be done. They could have enacted significant changes in between the performance I saw and the performance that ended up happening by the show's opening. It's unlikely, but it's possible. Further to that, I'm not even sure I could bring myself to sit down and film a really negative review of the last ever Sondheim musical. It's painful enough to be making this video, but all I know how to do on here is tell the truth. Whether you like it, whether I even like it, I'm not happy about this one, but this is how I feel about this show. I wasn't happy when I saw it. So I am going to tell you what I thought about it. If I had done a full review, it probably would have been a 2-star. In fact, no, it definitely would have been a 2-star review. But what I am just as interested about is all of the other reviews that have since come out, because the show opened over the weekend. So we're going to read through some of those, because I feel as though not all of these critics are being entirely honest with their verdicts. You know, they are talking about and addressing some of the show's shortcomings, but they're wrapping it up in a tremendously opaque wrapping paper of, but it's Sondheim and it's glorious. So we're going to try and unpack that in a way that lets you know what this show is like, what I thought about it, and what all the other critics thought about it as well. So here we go. Here are my thoughts / review roundup / explanation of the last ever Stephen Sondheim musical, Here We Are. If you enjoyed today's video, feel free to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. After this one, I'm going to take a break to do some crying, and then I'm going to come back here and tell you about all of the shows that I did love on Broadway. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any of those reviews. For now, let's talk about Here We Are. Okay, so let me tell you what this show actually is, because it's a little bit high concept. It's a surrealist work based on two different films from filmmaker Luis Buñuel. The first act is based on his 1972 film The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. The second act is based on his 1962 film The Exterminating Angel. What the two have in common is that they are both set at surreal dinner parties. Boy, does that come through. In Sondheim's own posthumous words, the first act is about trying to find a place to have dinner, relatable, and the second is about people who have had dinner and find themselves unable to leave, which he said is similar to his cheerful view of the world today. And if you think seeing the show will go any way towards helping you understand what he meant by that, unfortunately, I still have no idea. But it's a collaboration between Sondheim and the playwright David Ives, who has written many plays, my favourite of which is Venus in Fur. I think that's tremendous. And it's a collaboration in the sense that this feels very much like a David Ives play that features some music by Sondheim. Let's just say it. There is music in the first act, what you could technically call a score, but what isn't really comparable with any other Sondheim score that previously exists, even his weaker ones. And in the second act, there is a brief amount of music at the beginning, and then almost no music for the duration of the second act. There is very little music in the second act. We go for a very long time, for reasons that are made clear within the plot of the show, without music. And dramatically speaking, it probably makes sense for them to not have music, but for that reason, this doesn't feel like a Sondheim musical. I'm of the opinion that having a good time at the theatre is all about managing your expectations. There are weaker shows I saw in New York that I enjoyed more than this because I went into those expecting something frivolous and silly and light and fun, which they were, and I went into this expecting the last ever Sondheim masterpiece. That, in hindsight, was a mistake, and perhaps that was too lofty an expectation on my part, but at the very least I expected a musical, and that is not what this is. This is a David Ives play. It's a two-act play that features some music by Sondheim, and the music is characteristically Sondheim. It's beautifully familiar of moments of Into the Woods and Merrily in that particular phase of his career in Sunday in the Park with George. A lot of that comes through. There are these sort of arpeggio moments that feel very familiar of parts of Sunday in the Park with George and Into the Woods. But the night I saw this show, another critic asked me a very pertinent question, which is this the first time ever in his career that there is not one standout song? And I realised the answer was yes. There is no song that emerges, even in his weaker scores, even in Roadshow, for example, let's say that. There is a beautiful song, the best thing that ever has happened to me. And the other songs like Gold and Isn't He Something, still emerge more strongly than just about anything in Here We Are. Because it is surrealist and abstract, the music just kind of vaguely flows through the whole of the first act. It ebbs and flows with the script, which is the sign of a brilliant collaboration. I love that Sondheim can do that, but it does mean we don't get any sort of standalone song. We don't have that moment where everything just kind of pauses for a fantastic song to occur. You get that in every other score he's ever written. You do not get that in this. And even my friends who loved it, because it must be said, I went in a large group of people and I liked it the least. Just about everyone else enjoyed it more than I did. I asked them, could you name a particular, even without being able to recall the song, or name what you think the song would have been called? Could you tell me a particular moment where there was a song that emerged from this score? And the answer is no. If you don't need that from a score, then you still have the capacity to enjoy this. But if your expectation is that it's going to deliver at least one great song, it does not deliver that. It does not have the capabilities. I'm realizing this synopsis is turning more and more into me reviewing this show. If you can't tell, I'm very uncomfortable about coming on here and saying that I hated a Sondheim musical, but I'm also aware I'm about to read through a bunch of other critics' reviews, and it feels unfair of me not to tell you my opinion up front. So here we are. Here we are. What is done very well in this production is the marriage between these two films. They create an ensemble of characters that can fulfill the roles of each, and it feels cohesive. It feels completely cohesive. The second act feels not only like the logical conclusion to the first, but it feels like it takes the first act, it takes its charm and its sensibility, and it just kind of disorientates it a little bit and turns it on its head in a way that is familiar of a lot of other great Sondheim shows. Into the Woods springs to mind. Sunday in the Park with George springs to mind. The way in which the music disappears is because we have these characters who spent the first act, like I said, just looking for a restaurant in which to eat, with the end of the world looming, and they're a strange bunch to begin with, it must say. They eventually eat at this sort of palatial embassy to a presumably Latin American country, and they find that they are unable to leave this one particular room. Every time someone goes to leave the room at the end of the evening, they have the impulse to remain, and it slowly dawns on them that they're actually not able to leave. And then we have the subsequent sort of Lord of the Flies style descent into madness, where they are hoarding what little resources they have and trying to work out how to be around each other without going stir crazy, which of course they do. And amidst all of this, there is a grand piano in the center of the room, which the character of the bishop realizes is no longer working. It's no longer playing music, at which point we no longer hear music. The score ends and it just becomes a play for the second act until music returns right at the end. Whether this was always deliberate or whether this is a component of Sondheim's score being unfinished, I do not know, but it doesn't feel unnatural. It feels like a logical reason for there not to be music. I do not mind that. What I mind is that what music we have feels threadbare to begin with, which is why I struggle to hold this against Sondheim's other works, because he feels like a sizable collaborator in his other shows. It's the reason his shows are credited to him, even though he has always collaborated with great playwrights and book writers, with James Lapine and with John Weidman, and we always call them Sondheim shows, which is unfair and inaccurate in many ways, but this feels like a David Ives show, like I said, for which Sondheim has contributed some music. It just doesn't feel full enough to be a score. Joe Mantello has directed this, and he is a visionary director who has made as much sense as he can of this abstract, surrealist, sprawling thing that this is, and he does an excellent job of finding comedy within that, of trying to find threat and tension and genuine relationships among these nonsense characters. That we have so many notes of sincerity, I think, are a tribute to his work in this show. In the next part of this video, I am going to dispense a few spoilers about what happens in this plot, just to try and give you a sense of the madness of it all. So we begin on a completely blank white stage, where we meet this wealthy sort of industrial tycoon character and his charming wife. Two of their friends come over for dinner, but they weren't expecting them. She's a Hollywood agent, he's a plastic surgeon, and they're joined by others as well. I think Stephen Pasquale's character is like the ambassador to the nation of Miranda. The embassy they eventually end up having dinner at is his. Micaela Diamond's very sullen and challenging character is the sister of Rachel Bay Jones's character. Rachel Bay Jones is the charming wife of Bobby Cannavale, who was the industrious tycoon I told you about. And Micaela plays this perhaps non-binary, allegedly a lesbian, but falls in love with a man, revolutionary activist who is complicit in trying to bring about the abstract end of the world, which is, I guess, nigh, as it so often is in these things. And like I said, a staunch lesbian who rejects Stephen Pasquale's advances that he is making against just about every woman on this stage over the course of this two-act show. She does meet a young soldier who she instantly falls in love with, but that's not the only one of her convictions that she goes back on, because even though she is, you know, an activist for all sorts of liberal left-wing things, we see her being portrayed as utterly hypocritical because she enjoys the privileges that her friendship with all of these wealthy characters affords her. Which is a characterization I've seen multiple times and I'm just exhausted by, to be honest. I wish we didn't keep portraying these like climate activists and these left-wing activists as always being inherently hypocritical. I think that's a little bit of a socially irresponsible take, if I'm being completely honest. Amber Gray and Jeremy Shamos play that other couple I mentioned. She's the Hollywood agent, he's the plastic surgeon. She's having an affair with Stephen Pasquale. You also have Dennis O'Hare and Tracie Bennett, who portray various different staff members. They are waiters and butlers and maids. Dennis O'Hare's butler character becomes very consequential in the second act, as we get a little bit of a reveal as to who he really is. And we also have David Hyde Pierce, who arrives in endearing David Hyde Pierce fashion. He's sort of inescapably himself, but he's playing, I believe, a bishop is his technical religious rank, all done up and pope-like, who is having something of a crisis about his vocation and whether he's really any good at it. And he also has this fascination with women's shoes, which never once explained, but very funny. Almost all of these characters lack depth and much of a connection to what we would call reality, with the exception being Rachel Bay Jones. Hers is afforded a lot of quite lovely material, especially in the second act. She has some wonderful exchanges with David Hyde Pierce's character, where they talk sort of existentially about the nature of being alive. They almost say the words being alive as well, and just sort of holding your breath waiting for them to say being alive and give an Easter egg to one of Sondheim's greatest songs. But they don't, they just talk around the concept. She probably has the best sung material in the show as well. It helps that she's just this wonderful beam of light of a performer who we've seen previously in revivals of other shows bring depth and nuance to what were two-dimensional roles. There is one really great joke in the first act that gets referenced in the second, and it's the kind of a laugh that makes you realise by comparison, that there isn't as much humour in the rest of the thing. It's a gag about dogs. It's very, very funny, but it's like when you're sitting in the dark and someone turns the light on, and only then do you realise how dark it was. In the empty madness of the second act, there's also a moment where a black bear walks forward from the back of the stage and is noticed by Rachel Bay Jones, and then they dance. This goes largely unmentioned and entirely unexplained. There are a lot of discussions about where these characters are going to go to the bathroom when they're stuck in this one room together. There are multiple revelations about affairs. There is death. The death is then undone. The second act has a full and detailed set of this one room that rolls forwards to applause. But broadly, everyone is playing a sort of animated frustration and obnoxiousness in the first act, and then they are all playing despair and hysteria in the second. These are world-class performers, it must be said. Everyone is doing a fantastic job of trying to bring something to this material. It is well directed, it is well performed. The only problem is the material itself is wacky beyond all reason. And it must be said, I do not do well with abstract or surrealism at the best of times. This is not something that I particularly enjoy. I like for things to have a meaning. I don't like a choose-your-own-adventure in terms of what they're actually talking about. I struggle with Pinter for the same reason. But I've said that already, and I think at this point I've articulated clearly enough why I really didn't enjoy this production. Let's have a look at what some of the other critics thought. So Jesse Green from the New York Times, who is notoriously difficult to please, especially when it comes to musical theatre, said, "The best good news about Here We Are, the combo platter Buñuel musical that opened on Sunday at the Shed nearly 2 years after Sondheim's death in November 2021 is that it justifies the idea of merging these two works and succeeds in making a surrealist musical expressive. I agree with all of the above. In Joe Mantello's breathtakingly chic and shapely production, with a cast of Can You Top This Broadway treasures, it is never less than a pleasure to watch as it confidently polishes and embraces its illogic." And that's where he loses me, because, and again, I arrived with a sense of expectation. It's hard to imagine a lot of audience members coming to see the last ever Sondheim musical won't be expecting something pretty wonderful, and this, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, is not. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's never less than a pleasure to watch. I was not pleased. Musically, it's fully, if a little skimpily Sondheim. That's a very brief understatement right there, and entirely worthy of his catalogue. I disagree wholeheartedly. That it is also a bit cold, only occasionally moving in the way that song would ideally allow, may speak to the reason he had so much trouble writing it. I don't know what I make of this idea that only certain types of plots or certain tones can really sing. I think a great hallmark of Sondheim's career is his ability to find song in just about everything. If you look at what he's written in the past, Adam Feldman gave it 4 out of 5 stars in Time Out New York. Sondheim's final musical is not quite a full meal, not at least as a Sondheim musical per se, but how could it be? After working on the show sporadically for a decade or so, the irreplaceable Broadway auteur died in 2021, having written a fair amount for the first half, but not very much for the second, which goes much of the way to explain why the show is what it is. But if Here We Are amounts to a plate of hors d'oeuvres in the Sondheim oeuvre, which is a turn of phrase that I enjoy very much because hors d'oeuvres and oeuvre are spelt the same way. That's fun to look at, if not to hear. It is exquisitely well served in its world premiere at the Shed. Ives, director Joe Mantello, and the superb ensemble cast deliver a deluxe production. True, a production probably beyond what this material deserves, if I'm being completely honest. That it has such a great cast, that it has the production value that it does, is because of the Sondheim of it all. And there are newer, more exciting, dare I say, better works of musical theatre being written that don't have the same kind of opportunity. So, you know, it's tricky. Not that Sondheim doesn't deserve this kind of a salute, but I think that better salutes are being put together. It doesn't have to be a staging of this work. I don't need for this show to go to Broadway, is what I'm saying. A lot of people in New York right now are discussing over cocktails the idea that Here We Are is definitely going to move to Broadway because it has to, because it basically has to. But I don't think it should. I don't think it will win Best Musical. I don't think it should win Best Musical at the Tonys. But if it does go to Broadway, and if it does get nominated for that, and if it does win that, it is all going to be out of a sense of obligation and as a salute to his career and to his genius, and not because of the strength of this one show. And I kind of think it taints the memory of all of that. I also don't think that he would appreciate that. It feels patronizing. It's not like he was this artist who was never recognized or appreciated in his time. Certainly in his earlier career, his works didn't enjoy commercial success, but he lived long enough to see the tides changing on that. And even if he never had these huge, long-running commercial shows in his lifetime, we are just now beginning to see huge box office success for a show like Merrily We Roll Along that unfortunately he didn't live to see the Broadway transfer of. Then at least he saw a tremendous amount of love and critical recognition within the industry, and his show's getting revived all the time. Feldman goes on to say that Here We Are recognizes the character's corruption backed up against a plain white wall in Act 1, staring out at the audience. They call to mind a police lineup or perhaps a firing squad. Methinks the latter. The unsufferable people of Act 1 end up suffering in Act 2, which makes them, if not more sympathetic, at least a little humbler. He talks about some of the lyrics, which I do want to mention here because, I mean, this is always the thing we talk about with Sondheim, isn't it? Goodness me, how superficial, sings Marianne, that's Rachel Bay Jones's character, as she luxuriates in Zinn's sumptuous set. This is in the second act, when we have a set. Well, what's wrong with superficial? I want things to gleam, to be what they seem and not what they are. The barbed wit of those lyrics is archetypically Sondheimian, and Here We Are is studded with moments of verbal dazzle. Moments, that is, and they are few and far between. Dennis O'Hare also gets this little line that I've seen a lot of people talking about on social media. He says, "We do expect a little latte later, but we haven't got a lot of latte now." And everyone's saying, what a brilliant, classically Sondheimy joke. And maybe it is, but it's also not exceptionally high wit. It's not a joke that you haven't already heard delivered more cheaply elsewhere. There is a nice acknowledgement in the final paragraph that when the onstage piano goes quiet, the bishop comically says, "Rest in peace" to the piano, and this kind of takes on a broader significance, that we're talking about the music within the show, and we're talking about the writer of that music within the show, and it's a tribute to Sondheim, as is the whole thing. When I reviewed the Old Friends concert currently happening right now in London, I said that this at times felt like Sir Cameron Mackintosh was grieving publicly, but with a budget. And that's a lot of what I feel motivates this production as well. Only Old Friends remembers Sondheim at his very best and champions his most glorious work, while this is not really that. Adam Feldman ultimately, it seems, really enjoys the value of this production and all of the creative elements that have gone into it, but skips over the material itself, which feels a little bit conspicuous, but it's one way to justify a 4-star review. I do appreciate no one wants to be the critic who doesn't get the new Sondheim show, but all I can do is sit here and be honest and tell you I did not enjoy this, if I hadn't mentioned that already. Who else shall we read here? Where's Variety? So this is Naveen Kumar for Variety. As with many of the New York write-ups, there is no star rating. So this one talks about the cast of characters and makes a very smart inference. It says, "These are not psychologically complex characters whose interior lives are clarified in song, as many of Sondheim's other scores have done. Aside from a hallucinatory second-act reverie that gives Jones, Rachel Bay Jones, a production high point," I agree, I already agreed earlier in this video, "waiting for the end times proves less tuneful. Sondheim's score to the first act features motifs familiar from shows like Into the Woods, and the composer trying out a looser hand with profanity. Why not? Why not in your 90s start swearing in your musicals?" Interestingly enough, he wanted to put the F word in Sweeney Todd. He originally wanted the lyric to be "Sweeney pondered and Sweeney planned like an effing machine he planned," but he said it sounded more harsh in a British accent. Maybe they could have put it in this revival, since a British accent is barely present. There is at least one dud about a restaurant that's out of everything, but hearing new Sondheim is a thrill on its own. I mean, to say there is at least one dud and not one great song feels a conspicuous criticism that no one is really willing to hit on the head. In fact, Kumar says the combination of Sondheim's score with Ives' absurd and often hilarious book feels uneasy and disjointed, like they're pulling in opposite directions. Perhaps that's because the plot itself only stumbles forward first through non sequiturs and then inevitability. Like I said, I don't enjoy abstract, surrealist, aimless ponderings like this. Once the social satire of Here We Are has been established, the question merely goes from whether the rich will eat brunch to whether they'll eat each other. That's a nice description of the plot right there. This is quite a barbed final paragraph, actually. It says, Here We Are delights in the flavour of its vapid jet sets, but ultimately spits them out in a resolution that betrays its own internal logic. It's too much and robs the show of its potential teeth. Better to know when the feast is done. That's a very pointed final line, better to know when the feast is done. That to me says, ought this to have been produced in the first place in the half-finished state that it is? And that's a big part of why I don't think this ought to be considered alongside the rest of the Sondheim canon, is because it's really not finished from his perspective, and it's been put together in a way that feels like a finished show. You can go and watch this as a finished piece of theatre. It doesn't feel unfinished, but you can tell that the Sondheim of it all is, and he doesn't feel like a prominent collaborator in this in the way that he has in his previous shows. So this is one in the list of Sondheim musicals that is going to have an asterisk next to its name as far as I'm concerned. Let's read David Gordon's thoughts in Theatre Mania, the sister site to What's on Stage. While it doesn't quite reach the heights of Sondheim's canonical masterpieces, it is a delightful and emotional conclusion to the nonagenarian songwriter's resume, filled with the kind of reflections that you'd expect from someone who knows that the end is nigh. Morbid. Actually, I don't know that I got that necessarily. I really wish that had felt more present in his lyrics, but the whole thing lacks a clarity to be able to speak about anything. He's so good at sharply and specifically addressing characters' ideas and intentions and feelings, and really just exposing so much truth and reality in his previous shows that in something that's inherently surrealist, you're not going to get that. That, I think, perhaps is the biggest disappointment, and why Sondheim and this genre just do not mix for me. Those expecting a full Stephen Sondheim musical may be disappointed, and then some. Depending on how you look at it, it's either frustratingly unfinished, or a contemporary example of the genre-busting concept theatre that Sondheim ushered in with Company. I mean, this is true. Back in the day when he wrote Company, and that had sort of an abstract timeline, or Merrily We Roll Along, that had a full reverse timeline, or even Into the Woods. I'm not going to pretend that audiences would have been prepared for that or would have understood it, and perhaps I'm having the same reaction that people had when those shows first premiered, but at least they had songs. They at least had songs, that's all I'm saying. It says Joe Mantello's direction is impeccable. I do agree. More praise for David Zinn's costume and set design and Natasha Katz's ominous lighting. More love for the "we do expect a little latte later, but we haven't got a lot of latte now" line from Dennis O'Hare. It calls that one of Sondheim's cleverest bits of wordplay. Really? Really, David? Do we think that's one of Sondheim's cleverest bits of wordplay? He ends by saying, it's a surrealist puzzle that Sondheim and Ives clearly enjoyed trying to solve, and we'd be hard-pressed not to enjoy it ourselves. Again, this is talking about all of the shortcomings and this threadbare material, and just ties all of that up by saying, but it was really enjoyable, with no real qualification as to why. This is what frustrates me about this review, and about that Time Out review that we read as well, because it just says, you know what, it has all of these problems, all of these shortcomings, and it's not really complete, but I loved it. And this just feels like critics, you know, really bending over to try and show you that they got this show and that they liked this show, because everyone feels this weight of obligation that they have to like this show and they have to get it, otherwise you're not smart enough and you don't have the insight that is necessary to get a piece of theatre like this. They're afraid of being those people who didn't understand Sondheim's shows when they first premiered, especially with Merrily on Broadway being a huge success right now, and us being able to look back at those audiences who let it flop decades ago and saying they just didn't get it, but we do now because we're better. So when a new Sondheim musical has this world premiere, everyone is collectively terrified of being that first Merrily We Roll Along audience who didn't get the show, so that in decades from now, when Here We Are is being revived on Broadway and a huge success, people will look back at us and be like, they didn't get it. So to that end, everyone, I think, is really bending over backwards to try and convince themselves that this is a good piece of theatre and that this is a good musical, which it is not. There is a mention for orchestrator Jonathan Tunick and music supervisor and arranger Alexander Geminiani, who of course extensive Sondheim collaborators, and both must be credited for the extent to which this score sounds so familiar and so authentically Sondheimian. It's the presence of those two as it should be. Gordon says, Ives gleefully tortures the poor rich souls at length, ultimately offering more explanation for their entrapment than is dramatically necessary, given the world that he and Sondheim set up from the start. We get that the wealthy are oblivious to the plight of the working class. Hammering us with the idea is not very Buñuelian at all. Gosh, between Buñuelian and Sondheimian, we're making up a lot of words today. Finally, let's go to Johnny Oleksinski in the New York Post, which grabs us at the headline. Sondheim's last musical sadly doesn't sing. It was always wishful thinking to believe that Stephen Sondheim's final musical, which was tinkered with for almost a decade before the composer died in 2021, would hold a candle to his finest works. I mean, it's been an awful long time since his finest works. Really, the greatest stuff he ever wrote was in the 70s and in the 80s. The later stuff, Passion is not my favourite. Roadshow, like I said, there is gold to be found in Roadshow, but broadly the whole thing is a little bit sepia tone. And his shows, while still valid pieces of art, were increasingly getting a little bit dull in the later years of his career. So my greatest fear for Here We Are Before I Saw It was that it would be dull. It is anything but dull, it's wild. It's just not a musical. Oh, Johnny is saying the same thing. He says, but even going in with modest expectations and the awareness that Sondheim hadn't created a strong show in nearly 30 years, the last one being Passion in 1994, we kind of agree on that one. Here We Are still disappoints. It's less a musical than it is a shiny curiosity. Now I'm going to get mathematical about this. He gave it a 1.5 star rating out of 4 though, not out of 5. So to extrapolate and turn that into a review out of 5 stars, we have to multiply it by 1.25. And 1.5 times 1.25 is going to be 1.875, which is essentially a 2-star review. This goes on to say that director Joe Mantello and book writer David Ives have come up with a dubious reason for the growing lack of a score, that the music drains from the story as the character's situation becomes increasingly forlorn, which honestly is not a good reason when put that way, because there are so many situations where sometimes characters find themselves hugely forlorn and all they do is sing about it. Like, this kind of emotional well that they find themselves in is not a good reason not to sing. It's just a problem that the show has that it has to deal with. Here We Are gets by on disguising wafer-thin material with visual splendour and tiresome wackiness. Ives, the occasionally indulgent writer of Broadway's Venus in Fur and All in the Timing, is the dominant artistic force here, not Sondheim. I agree completely, I said it already. Dennis O'Hare and Tracie Bennett amusingly play beleaguered waiters at all 3 eateries with changing accents and attitudes to match. And both, I think, are incredibly underused here. I think many of these people, Micaela Diamond in particular, has a really awful character to contend with, but Tracie Bennett, exceptionally underused. I don't know why they bothered to fly Tracie Bennett over to New York just to barely use her in this show. The tunes in the first half are pleasant, but just not up to the composer-lyricist's usual level of wit or musical distinctiveness. Those are the 2 things I agree that are really lacking here. The cast sings a repeated ho-hum song about this perfect day. What's missed everywhere is passion. In Sondheim's other experimental musicals, Assassins, one of my favourites, which I've forgotten to mention thus far, Profiling Presidential Killers, and Sunday in the Park with George, Heat arrives in the most unexpected ways and places. The sound of Here We Are, however, lands on either soothing or silly always. The always fabulous Rachel Bay Jones, whose Marianne is a self-satisfied dimwit, starts the second act off crooning about the joys of superficiality and utters one of the few lyrics that calls back to Sondheim at his best. I don't need to read between the lines are just fine. She has some lovely moments in that start of the second act. Johnny finishes by saying the novelty of attending Sondheim's final musical and experiencing its non-stop zaniness wear off long before Here We Are ends and the whole thing falls apart. Many elements here are ideal. The wonderful cast is as dreamlike as Buñuel's Strange Story. Mantello, the director who finally got Assassins right in 2004, sleekly stages the action such as it is, and Zin's set is a dying breed of design that gets entrance applause, like I mentioned. But none of that matters much when the hat isn't finished. And we'll end it there because I think that says it better than I could. Sondheim, who is remembered for so many great songs, including finishing The Hat, about, the challenging process of making art, here is remembered with a hat that is unfinished. And I wonder whether he even gave this his blessing, whether he'd have even been happy for his work to be staged in this incomplete state. Perhaps he did, perhaps that's already been clarified somewhere, I do not know. For now, Here We Are is currently playing off-Broadway, it's had its opening, the reviews have emerged, they do tend to put this kind of a positive spin on it. Most of them read very well while addressing the inherent and unavoidable shortcomings, but they don't seem to want to really criticize the production for that. I wonder whether it's really fair to afford even the giant that is Sondheim, the legend that he is, this level of kindness in reviews, a kindness that is not extended to new writers and emerging writers in the same way, who arguably are more needing that sort of a lighter critical touch. I'd maybe even go as far as to say that typifies one of the problems within the world of criticism, where if someone has already earned their reputation, then people go a little bit softer on them than someone who is still trying to break through, whose attempts to do so will not be helped by a very harsh review. I don't know, perhaps I'm overthinking all of this, but what I do want to do next is to hear from all of you. So in the comments section down below, and I am anticipating many people disagreeing with me wildly about this because I know already that some of you loved it, let me know what you thought of Here We Are if you have seen it at the Shed. All responses are welcome. In fact, I'm particularly eager to hear from you. If you loved this, what did you love about it? Where do you think it sits alongside Sondheim's other work? And do we think it is going to go to Broadway? I am so curious to see how this all unfolds. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope that you have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more videos coming very soon, including reviews of all the other shows I saw while I was in New York, most of which I really did enjoy. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!